In chapter 14, we'll be looking at adolescence and more specifically the biosocial components of adolescence. So first of all, we'll be taking a look at puberty, and a good way to think about puberty is that's the time that the adolescents first experience an onrush of hormones and full adult physical development, and that usually lasts between 3 to 5 years. Now, obviously, during puberty, that is when girls' menstrual periods begin to develop, and that refers to females beginning ovulation. And also, boys develop their ability to, create sperm and everything, and so that is the development of their sexual capacities and hormones. Now, on the topic of hormones here, remember, hormones are the chemical substances that produced from the pituitary gland, and the gland that's actually in the brain, and that receives a signal from the hypothalamus, and which triggers the production of a lot of hormones, and especially things like adrenal and sex glands. Now, in puberty, that begins with hormonal signals from the hypothalamus to the pituitary gland. And the pituitary, once it receives that signal, it signals the adrenal glands and the ovaries or testes to produce more of their hormones. And and they refer to the adrenal glands, actually, those are located right above the kidneys. And those produce things like stress hormones, say epinephrine and norepinephrine. Now, definitely when people get into the phase of puberty, their circadian rhythms start to change pretty drastically. And so that means, they use this term here, it's in quotes, called eveningness. And all that refers to basically is the tendency to start staying up later at night. And so they say, that tends to, kind of result in things like insomnia, mood disorders, sleepiness, during the day, interference with learning, definitely affects their school, performance and everything. And so they do mention, some things too that, especially these days, that those in puberty may experience a lot, but they will be, their sleep can be influenced by things like computer lights, TV, texting, things like that. So those definitely influence one's circadian rhythms. So this just refers to, this is just a reminder here, that a very large percentage of high school students, they experience sleep deprivation. And that might have to do something with what, remember, they referred to as eveningness, the kind of the tendency to want to stay up later at night. Now, brain growth during adolescence, they say, that is the usual sequence of brain maturation, and it's propelled by hormones that activate the limbic system at puberty. And that can lead to some dangers, they say, so there is a steady maturation of the prefrontal cortex that occurs throughout that, but also very dramatic hormonal growth, which affects one's limbic system. And if you remember from previous chapters, when we looked at parts of the brain, the limbic system is very closely associated with emotional type processes. So one of the structures in the limbic system is called the amygdala, and they say that right here at the bottom, the direct hormonal influence of the amygdala, which greatly affects the person's emotional processes. Now, unfortunately, so during that time, brain immaturity that actually makes teenagers a little more vulnerable to social pressure and stresses. So we have seen that, and we know that at that age, those in puberty and adolescence, they put great importance on how they fit in their social, like amongst their friends and in their social environments and everything. And so they mention right here that MRI brain scans, reveal that the prefrontal cortex is limited in connections and engagement before adulthood. So definitely, the those areas of the brain right there, the prefrontal cortex, it is not fully developed, and that's why uh, kids of that age, they tend to um, be a little more emotionally driven, a little more emotionally compelled to do things without thinking ahead of time what the results of their actions might be. So, and then finally, they mention, that there's actually in the brain, the reward centers are more developed than the parts of the brain that deal with reflection. Looking, metacognition, thinking about one's thinking and how one's actions will result in certain, um, uh, I guess you could say, effects. So they mention that here, and they say when stress, and arousal, passion, sensory bombardment, drugs, deprivation is extreme, an adolescent brain is overtaken by impulses that might shame adults. So let's move on here. So the benefits of adolescent brain development, on the other hand, so the pros, that so there's increased myelination, and that decreases their reaction time, so they can develop the capacity to do things quicker, a lot more accurately, and enhance dopamine activity. So that enhanced dopamine activity, that refers to the capacity to experience more pleasurable experiences. And then finally, they talk about another one of the pros, involved with adolescent brain development is the synaptic growth. And that enhances moral development and openness to new experiences and ideas. So just more brain connection overall. Okay, so a couple things on this slide right here. That pubertal hormones begin to accelerate between ages 8 and 14. And then further down here, they tend to say that girls generally develop ahead of boys. And so that can be by, 1 to 2 to 3 years in advance. And then children who have a relatively large proportion of body fat, they experience puberty a little bit sooner than do their thinner contemporaries. Now, that is just a generalization. That's not a rule. Okay, so early maturing girls, they tend to experience a little bit lower of self-esteem, um, a little more depression and poorer body image than later maturing girls. And so they may be attracted to older boyfriends and enter into abusive relationships more often than other girls. Now, once again, these are generalizations. These are not rules. This doesn't apply to each and every young female at that age. Now, for boys, during adolescence, size and maturation are important, definitely for all boys, no matter what, where they come from and where they're at. So they do mention that early maturing boys, they're more aggressive, they may break rules more often, and they may actually start using alcohol a little earlier than later maturing boys. Now, the boys who develop a little more slowly, they can experience a little more depression, and be a little more, have a little more anxiety and afraid of sexual type encounters. Okay, so growth spurts, that's relatively sudden and rapid physical growth that occurs during puberty. So what's interesting about that is they say that weight usually precedes height, and growth of the limbs precedes growth of the torso. So the person's limbs, arms, legs, they may grow longer and everything, ahead of the growth of the torso. Now, transformations here of puberty, this is that refers to organ growth. So um, lungs, they triple in weight, and adolescents, they develop breathing. It becomes deeper and slower, and their heart doubles in size at that age. Now their skin and hair, it becomes, a little more prone to acne. They say oilier, sweatier, and hair on the head and the limbs, it becomes coarser and darker, and new hair grows under arms, on faces, and over the sex organs. Now, diet deficiencies at that age can be definitely cause problems with growth, both neurophysiologically and physiologically. And important things, deficiencies in iron, calcium, zinc, and other minerals, those are really important for bone and muscle growth. So if those are not met, those needs are not met, that could cause maturation issues. Now, as far as nutrition, body image, that involves a person's idea of how his or her body looks. And so few adolescents are satisfied with their bodies. And so girls, they diet partly because boys tend to prefer to date thin girls. So that makes, girls a little more self-conscious and more prone to reducing their caloric input. And then boys, they naturally tend to want to look, taller and stronger, because they feel that, girls tend to value well-developed muscles in males. And which, as we mentioned, when one starts to diet, and decrease their caloric input, that can result in eating disorders. And so they mention a couple here: anorexia nervosa. That is actually kind of a form of self-starvation. And under that too, those suffering from anorexia nervosa, they'll not only greatly decrease their eating quantities, but they will tend to over-exercise and everything, which will affect, that could really affects their organs and everything, and that can actually result in, can be fatal, to result in fatal results. And then we are going to refer to bulimia nervosa. So bulimia, that's just binge eating and subsequent purging, so eating a lot of food and then forcing themselves to basically throw up, which is what we call purging. Okay, we'll skip this here and we'll go into, so they say the origins of disordered eating, those can be cultural, that can be stress induced, that can be puberty, that can be hormones, that can be childhood patterns, things they learned, as they were growing up from their environment. And then finally, definitely things that can reduce that from occurring are healthy eating in childhood and eating together with their families. So that way they're not completely on their own. Now we've got these right here, the sexual maturation here, primary sex characteristics. Those are parts of the body that are involved in reproduction, the sex organs and the ovaries and things like that. Now the secondary sex characteristics, those are the physical traits, that are not directly involved, like shape, hair patterns, breasts and that kind of thing. Okay, so we're almost done here. So there's the